Let's start with Mary Thompson. At 42, Mary lived alone in her quaint two-story house. Divorced and with her children grown and moved away, she often felt the sting of loneliness. Mary was attractive in a subdued way. She worked as a librarian, a job she loved but which also contributed to her solitary existence. Now, across the street lived a young man named Jason. At 19, Jason was at that awkward stage between boyhood and manhood. Tall and lean, with dark hair and piercing blue eyes, he had an aura of youthful arrogance mixed with an underlying vulnerability. Jason was taking college exams, spending his days by booksa, and doing odd jobs around the neighborhood, helping his parents with their small landscaping business. Their paths first crossed one summer day when Mary, struggling with a particularly heavy box in her garage, found herself suddenly assisted by Jason. He had seen her from across the street and offered his help. It was an innocent enough beginning, but it planted the seeds of something far more complicated. Here it all begins. The Johnson family was a bit of a mystery to the townsfolk. They kept to themselves, never really mingling with the locals. But what caught Mary's attention wasn't Mr. or Mrs. Johnson, but their 19-year-old son, Jason. Jason often helped his parents with chores around the house, and sometimes Mary would watch him from her kitchen window, feeling a stir of emotions she hadn't felt in years. Mary was immediately struck by Jason's youthful energy and charm, something that had been absent from her life for years. His presence was like a breath of fresh air, breaking the monotony of her routine. At first, their interactions were innocuous. Jason would stop by to help with her garden or carry groceries from her car. Mary would thank him with a warm smile, and they'd chat for a few minutes about the weather or neighborhood gossip. It was all very innocent on the surface. One day, after Jason went from university, Mary asked him for help with some heavy furniture. After that, Mary invited him to stay for lunch. She prepared a simple meal, but it felt like a feast. They sat on her back porch, enjoying the summer sun and each other's company. Conversation flowed easily, and Mary found herself laughing more than she had in years. Jason, with his boyish charm, shared stories about his friends and his plans for the future. Mary, in turn, opened up about her past, her marriage, and the loneliness that had settled into her life since her children moved away. But beneath that surface, Mary felt a stirring she hadn't experienced in a long time. Jason's athletic build, his confident stride, and the way he looked at her with genuine interest and curiosity made her feel desirable again. She found herself looking forward to his visits, her heart skipping a beat whenever she saw him approaching her house. From that day on, Jason started coming over more often. At first, it was just to help with odd jobs around the house, but soon they were spending more time together. They became close, too close, some would say. Mary began to feel something very warm towards the guy, and she was still a woman who needed male warmth. She decided to create an opportunity that would allow them to be alone together, away from prying eyes and judgmental whispers. One warm summer evening, Mary sent Jason a message on WhatsApp. Her fingers trembled as she typed, "Hey Jason, could you come over tomorrow? My back door is broken and I need some help fixing it. I'd really appreciate it." Jason replied quickly, "Sure thing, Mary. I'll be there around 5 p.m. The next day, Mary prepared for Jason's visit with a mixture of excitement and nervous anticipation. She wore a simple yet flattering dress, letting her hair fall loosely around her shoulders. She wanted to look her best for him. As the clock neared 5 p.m., she checked her reflection one last time, then went to the kitchen to pour herself a glass of wine, hoping it would calm her nerves. When Jason arrived, Mary greeted him with a warm smile and led him to the back door. The evening sun cast a golden glow over the house, creating a cozy and intimate atmosphere. Jason examined the door, which Mary had intentionally loosened to create a pretext for his visit. "Looks like the hinges are loose," Jason said, inspecting the door. "I'll just need to tighten them up." As Jason worked on the door, Mary watched him, feeling a growing sense of desire. She knew this was her chance. She poured another glass of wine and offered it to Jason. "Here, have a drink," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "You've earned it." Jason accepted the glass with a smile. They stood in the kitchen, sipping their wine and chatting. Mary's heart raced as she tried to think of a way to move closer to him. She reached out and touched his arm lightly. Before Jason could react, Mary kissed him. It was a gentle, tentative kiss at first, but it quickly deepened as Jason responded. The wine, the atmosphere, and the sheer intensity of the moment overwhelmed him. He wrapped his arms around Mary, pulling her close. They stumbled into the living room, their kisses growing more passionate and urgent. Mary's hands roamed over Jason's body, exploring the contours of his young, muscular frame. Jason, though inexperienced, followed her lead, his desire overcoming any lingering doubts. Mary guided him to the couch, pushing him down gently. She straddled his lap, her dress hitching up as she moved. Jason's hands found her hips, and he looked up at her with a mix of awe and desire. Mary smiled, feeling a rush of power and excitement. With slow, deliberate movements, Mary undressed him, taking her time to savor each moment. Jason's breath hitched as she kissed her way down his chest, her hands exploring his body with practiced ease. She removed her own dress, letting it fall to the floor. They made love on the couch, the room filled with the sounds of their passion. For Jason, it was an overwhelming, almost surreal experience. Mary's touch was both gentle and demanding, guiding him through the intensity of his first time. She reveled in the sensation of his youthful energy, the way he responded to her every touch and kiss. Afterward, they lay together on the couch, their bodies entwined. Jason's head rested on Mary's chest, and she stroked his hair, a contented smile on her lips. The room was filled with a quiet post-coital glow, the aftermath of their intense connection. "You're amazing," Jason said softly, his voice filled with awe and gratitude. Mary kissed the top of his head. "So are you," she replied. "You've made me feel alive again." They stayed like that for a while, savoring the intimacy and warmth of the moment. For Mary, it was a dream come true, a chance to relive her youth and experience a love she had thought was lost forever. For Jason, it was the beginning of a complicated, passionate, and ultimately tragic affair. But for now, in the quiet of Mary's living room, all that mattered was their connection, the way they made each other feel. The future and its complications were far away, and they were content to lose themselves in the present, in the heat of their newfound love. Mary's house that night with a feeling of exhilaration and a sense of newfound maturity. He felt different, like he had crossed an invisible threshold into adulthood. The experience with Mary had been more than just his first time. It had been an awakening. He walked home with a spring in his step, the cool night air invigorating him as he replayed the evening in his mind. When he finally reached his house, he tried to slip in quietly, hoping to avoid any questions from his parents. But as he entered the living room, he found his mother, Karen, waiting for him on the couch, her eyes fixed on the door. The room was dimly lit, casting long shadows that made Karen's expression hard to read. "Jason, where have you been?" she asked, her voice calm but with an edge of suspicion. Jason, still on the high from his time with Mary, hadn't prepared an excuse. His mind raced, and he blurted out the first thing that came to him. "I was with my friends, Mom. We were just hanging out." Karen's eyes narrowed slightly. She had seen him go to Mary's house earlier in the evening, and had noticed he hadn't left for several hours. She had been concerned and decided to wait up for him, a growing sense of unease gnawing at her. "Which friends?" she asked, trying to sound casual but feeling a knot of worry tighten in her stomach. Jason hesitated for a moment, then named a few friends from school. "Tom, Jake, and Alex. We just hung out at Tom's place. Nothing special." Karen nodded slowly, not wanting to push too hard just yet. "All right. Just make sure you don't stay out too late, okay? I worry about you." "I know, Mom. Sorry about that," Jason replied, offering her a reassuring smile. "Good night, Jason," she said, her eyes still studying him as he turned to head upstairs. "Good night, Mom," Jason replied, making his way to his room. As he climbed the stairs, Karen remained seated, her mind racing. She didn't want to jump to conclusions, but something felt off. She knew Jason well, and his behavior tonight was unusual. The way he had answered her questions, the slight hesitation, and the fact that she had seen him go to Mary's house all pointed to something he wasn't telling her. Upstairs, Jason collapsed onto his bed, still buzzing from the night's events. He knew he had to be more careful in the future, but the thrill of his secret relationship with Mary made it difficult to think clearly. He felt alive, invigorated in a way he had never experienced before. For the next few days, Karen kept a close eye on Jason, her suspicions growing with each passing hour. She noticed the small changes in his behavior, the way he seemed more distracted, the frequent glances at his phone, and the fact that he was often lost in thought. She decided to bide her time and gather more information before confronting him. Meanwhile, Jason and Mary continued their affair with increasing intensity. They found ways to steal moments together, communicating through WhatsApp and arranging secret meetings whenever they could. Each encounter deepened their bond and their passion, making it harder for Jason to hide his feelings. One afternoon, Karen decided to take matters into her own hands. She waited until Jason left the house, then followed him discreetly. Her heart pounded as she kept her distance, watching as he made his way to Mary's house once again. She parked a few houses away and waited, her mind racing with possibilities. Jason knocked on Mary's door, and she opened it with a warm smile. They embraced, and Karen watched from her car, feeling a mixture of anger, betrayal, and concern. She couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language spoke volumes. It was clear that their relationship was more than just friendly. Karen stayed in her car for over an hour, watching as Jason and Mary interacted inside the house. Her suspicions were confirmed, but she needed to know more. She needed to understand what had drawn her son to this older woman and why he was risking so much for her. Back at home, Karen confronted Jason as soon as he returned. She tried to stay calm, but her emotions were running high. "Jason, I need to talk to you," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Jason looked at her, sensing the seriousness in her tone. "What's wrong, Mom?" "I followed you today," she admitted, her eyes searching his face for a reaction. "I saw you go to Mary's house." Jason's heart sank. He hadn't expected this confrontation so soon. "Mom, I can explain." "Explain what, Jason?" Karen interrupted, her voice rising. "What is going on between you and Mary?" Jason took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "We've been spending time together. She's lonely, and so am I. We've become close." Karen's eyes filled with tears, a mix of anger and sadness. "She's more than twice your age, Jason. This isn't right. She's taking advantage of you." Jason felt a surge of frustration. "You don't understand, Mom. You've never felt the way I feel right now. She makes me feel alive." Karen reached out, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Jason, I love you, and I just want what's best for you. Please, think about what you're doing. This relationship isn't right." Jason pulled away, feeling torn between his mother's concern and his feelings for Mary. "I'm not a kid anymore, Mom. I can make my own decisions." Karen watched him go, her heart heavy with worry. She knew she couldn't force him to end the relationship, but she couldn't stand by and do nothing. Over the next few weeks, Jason's life began to return to a semblance of normalcy. He threw himself into his studies, spending long hours in the library, and reconnected with his friends, who welcomed him back into their fold with open arms. He even picked up his old hobbies again, like playing soccer in the park and strumming his guitar in the evenings. On the surface, everything seemed to be getting better. Karen watched her son carefully, still wary but hopeful. She noticed that he no longer seemed distracted or secretive. During the day, he no longer visited Mary's house. Instead, he stayed at school or came home directly after his extracurricular activities. Karen saw him laughing with his friends again, his eyes bright with the spark she had missed seeing for so long. The change in Jason's behavior gave Karen a cautious sense of relief. She hoped that the intensity of his feelings for Mary had faded, and that he had come to see the wisdom in ending their relationship. Despite her lingering worries, she decided not to bring up the subject again. She didn't want to reopen old wounds or risk pushing Jason back towards Mary. Instead, She focused on supporting him and helping him move forward. One evening, as they sat together in the living room, Karen noticed that Jason seemed genuinely relaxed for the first time in months. He was sprawled out on the couch, flipping through channels with a carefree expression. "How was school today?" she asked, trying to keep the conversation light. Jason smiled. "It was good, Mom. I aced my math test, and the soccer coach said I might make the starting lineup for the next game." Karen's heart warmed at the sight of his happiness. "That's fantastic, Jason. I'm so proud of you." "Thanks," he said, his smile widening. "I've been working hard." "I can tell," Karen replied. "It's good to see you enjoying yourself again." One sunny Saturday morning, the house was abuzz with the normalcy of a weekend routine. Karen was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, the scent of bacon and fresh coffee filling the air. Jason shuffled into the kitchen, still in his pajamas, his hair disheveled. Despite his usual cheerfulness, there was something different about him. As he sat down at the breakfast table, Karen couldn't help but notice a subtle change. Jason appeared unusually subdued. His eyes were heavy-lidded, and he had a faint, almost imperceptible shadow under them. The sparkle that had been so prominent in his eyes recently seemed dimmer. Karen watched as he struggled to keep his head up, occasionally yawning and rubbing his eyes. It was as if Jason had not slept well, or perhaps not at all. Karen tried to focus on making small talk and keeping the breakfast conversation light, but her concern grew. His tiredness was out of character for the vibrant young man who had been so energetic and enthusiastic in the past weeks. As they ate, Karen noticed that Jason's movements were slow and lethargic. He seemed to be eating more mechanically than with his usual appetite. There was a lack of the usual excitement or interest in the food, which was unlike him. When Karen gently asked if he was feeling okay, Jason merely shrugged it off, mumbling that he was probably just tired from the camping trip and needed a good rest. Karen decided to let the matter rest for the moment, but kept a close eye on him throughout the day. She watched as Jason retreated to his room, a place he had rarely used for solitude in recent weeks. The door was closed, and she could hear the soft hum of his laptop, or perhaps a faint sound of a game. Hours passed, and he remained in his room, occasionally coming out for water or a quick snack, but otherwise staying withdrawn. As the days turned into weeks, Karen's initial relief began to wane, replaced by a creeping sense of unease. Despite Jason's efforts to reintegrate into his usual routines, his persistent fatigue and occasional absences at night sparked a new wave of concern. The tranquility of their home had returned, but Karen couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was amiss. It was late one evening when Karen's suspicions were confirmed. She was in the kitchen, preparing a late-night snack, when she noticed a familiar pattern. Jason's room had been dark for hours, but suddenly she saw a sliver of light beneath his door. Curious and concerned, she peered through the crack, only to see that Jason was absent from his room. His bed was untouched, and his belongings were in disarray. Karen felt a pang of worry. Where could he have gone at this hour? She recalled how, during the height of his relationship with Mary, Jason would often leave the house at odd hours and return with an air of secrecy. Now it seemed as though history might be repeating itself. With a heavy heart, Karen tried to piece together the clues. Jason's sleepiness and increasing late-night absences suggested that he might be slipping back into old habits. Determined to uncover the truth, Karen decided to keep a closer watch. Over the next few nights, she began to monitor his movements more intently. She noticed that he would often leave the house around midnight, slipping out quietly and returning several hours later with the same tired look on his face. Each time, he would be evasive when she asked about his whereabouts, offering vague answers about meeting friends or just being out for a walk. The pattern was unmistakable. Jason was going somewhere after hours, and Karen's intuition told her that he was likely visiting Mary. The thought filled her with a mix of dread and frustration. She had hoped that the break from Mary would be a clean slate, but it seemed that Jason was struggling to break free from the grip of the relationship that had so profoundly affected him. Karen was faced with a difficult decision. She knew that confronting Jason directly might lead to conflict, but the idea of him slipping back into the unhealthy relationship with Mary was unbearable. She remembered the intense and bitter arguments she had with Mary, the accusations, the harsh words exchanged. Their quarrel had been deep and personal, and she had no desire to revisit that painful chapter. Karen's patience was wearing thin. Despite her efforts to steer Jason away from Mary through gentle conversations and support, it seemed that nothing was working. Jason's late-night absences persisted, and his evasive responses only fueled her suspicions. Her frustration mounted with each passing day, and her concern for her son's well-being reached a boiling point. Deciding that she needed concrete evidence to confront the situation, Karen resolved to catch Jason in the act. If she could witness his actions firsthand, it might be enough to force him to face the truth and end the relationship once and for all. The thought of another confrontation with Mary was daunting, but Karen felt that it was a necessary step to protect her son. One night, Karen decided to put her plan into action. She stayed up late, her eyes trained on Jason's room. When he stealthily slipped out of the house through his window, she knew this was her opportunity. With her heart pounding in her chest, she followed him at a careful distance. She watched as he climbed over the fence and made his way towards Mary's house, the dim light casting long shadows on the ground. Karen's mind raced with a mix of anxiety and determination. She kept herself hidden in the darkness, moving as quietly as possible. When Jason reached Mary's house, he let himself in through a side door, leaving it slightly ajar. Karen approached cautiously, her breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts. The moment she entered the house, she was hit by the scent of women's perfume mingled with the distinct aroma of alcohol. The smell was almost overpowering, and it drove home the reality of the situation. Her emotions surged, a tempest of anger and desperation clouding her judgment. She followed the sounds of laughter and murmured conversation, her footsteps muffled by the plush carpeting. The scene she encountered was like a punch to the gut. Jason and Mary were in the middle of their intimacy, their clothing scattered around the room. Jason was in the process of removing Mary's clothes, and the sight of them together filled Karen with a blinding rage. Without thinking, Karen burst into the room, her voice breaking the silence with a thunderous shout. "Jason, Mary, what is this? How could you do this?" The sudden intrusion startled both Jason and Mary. Jason's face flushed with shock and guilt, while Mary's eyes widened in disbelief. The confrontation was immediate and explosive. Karen's anger erupted like a volcano, and she began shouting accusations and demands, her voice echoing through the house. Mary, equally enraged, jumped to her feet. "Karen, what are you doing here? This is none of your business." Jason, caught between the two women, tried to intervene. "Mom, you need to calm down. This isn't helping anything." But Karen's fury was uncontainable. She advanced on Mary, her hands gripping her shoulders as they began to grapple. The physical struggle was intense. The women's hair was tangled, and their voices were raised in a cacophony of anger and pain. In the chaos, they pulled at each other's hair, shouting insults and desperate pleas. Jason tried to separate them, his face a mask of panic and frustration. His attempts to calm the situation only made things worse. In the heat of the moment, he grabbed Mary's arm and yanked her away from Karen, with more force than intended. The movement was sudden and uncontrolled, and Mary lost her balance. The world seemed to slow as Mary stumbled backwards. She fell down a flight of steps leading to the lower level of the house. Her head struck the edge of a step with a sickening thud, and a stream of blood began to flow from the wound. The sight of her lying motionless at the bottom of the stairs sent a chill through Karen's spine. In a daze of horror and shock, Karen rushed to Mary's side, her hands trembling as she tried to assess the severity of the injury. Mary's breathing was shallow, and the blood pooled around her head. Karen's mind raced as she scrambled for her phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. The operator's calm instructions did little to ease Karen's frantic state. She stayed on the line, trying to follow the advice while keeping an eye on Mary, who lay unconscious on the floor. The sound of sirens grew louder, and Karen's heart pounded in her chest as she waited for the emergency responders to arrive. When the paramedics finally burst through the door, their professionalism and efficiency contrasted sharply with the chaos that had unfolded. They quickly assessed Mary's condition and began administering first aid. Karen stood back, her emotions a whirlwind of guilt and grief. Despite their best efforts, the paramedics couldn't save Mary. She was pronounced dead at the scene, the severity of her injuries too great for any intervention to make a difference. The shock of the outcome was overwhelming, and Karen found herself grappling with the weight of the consequences of her actions. The police arrived soon after, and Karen was left to explain the night's events. The scene was a blur of flashing lights and stern questions. Jason, too, was in a state of shock, his face pale and his demeanor numb. The gravity of the situation began to sink in, and the reality of what had transpired hit harder than any of them could have imagined. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached their verdicts. Karen was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter. The jury concluded that while she had not intended to kill Mary, her reckless actions had directly resulted in Mary's death. The court sentenced Karen to a significant prison term, reflecting the gravity of her role in the tragic events. Jason was found guilty of reckless endangerment. The jury acknowledged his intent to separate the women, but determined that his method of intervention was reckless and had contributed to the fatal accident. He received a lesser sentence compared to Karen, reflecting the court's recognition of his intent to de-escalate rather than escalate the situation. In this scenario, Karen was convicted of involuntary manslaughter. Considering the intense emotions and lack of premeditation involved, the court might have opted for a more lenient approach. Instead of a lengthy prison term, Karen was sentenced to 2 years in prison. This sentence took into account her remorse, the fact that her actions were driven by a desperate attempt to protect her son, and the absence of malicious intent. Jason, found guilty of reckless endangerment, also received a more lenient sentence in this adjusted scenario. His role in the incident, while reckless, was viewed through the lens of his intent to separate the women rather than cause harm. Jason was sentenced to 2 years in prison as well.